the cross. That is to say, just the horizontal and the vertical piece without anybody on it is the symbol of the human condition, which is crucified literally between heaven and earth. An idea that has been vigorously reinforced by the scientific hypothesis and pretty much accepted as the reality of the evolutionary process beginning with the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago. So we're dealing with a cosmic symbol that includes all of time and, as we will see, without exhausting it, includes all of eternity. There's post-time. So what does evolution present to us? It shows us a development of the atomic energies, and both visible and invisible, that are shared in or participated in by matter, which reveal a ever complex tendency towards bigger and better or more complex or more elements, to put it in terms of those, all of which seem to have a purpose of establishing some place in the material universe where life can exist. And this can only happen when certain elements are available, and a certain amount of protein and oxygen, and the universe has kindly provided this, although it has taken her quite a bit of time. And maybe 4 billion years ago, this universe stabilized enough, and Earth found itself in just the right proportion in its relationship of distance to the sun to provide life. And then there was some life, and then the plant life discovered at some point, with the help of more oxygen and certain other elements, that it could psychosynthesize, that is, change the energy of the sun into nutrition. So this is when life really took off, and I guess. And life manifests itself first on the vegetative plane, that involves 3 powers, that is, growth, nutrition, and reproduction. And at some point, plants started to become animals, and animals became mammals, and the brain started getting a little bigger. And other factors developed over a couple of billion years, and then in species that specialized in their own survival, they didn't further the process of evolution too well. So it was more the undifferentiated species that were open to growth and development that gradually evolved into hominids out of the primates of apes and chimpanzees and so on. All of which took some more time, and at some point the hominids started walking around, and their brains were big enough, and the neocortex began to form, which is the area of the brain that is responsible for self-consciousness, or the capacity to reflect on experience. And apparently God was looking for some response of his long efforts. And so the formation of human beings continued for a long time, just in their capacity to function with greater intelligence, but not significantly different stages of consciousness. And what prompted them to migrate out of Africa, that seems to be the main starting point, is not known. Or why one species pushed out the Neanderthal man that got as far as Europe. We don't know all of these things by any means yet. But at some point, the species developed this capacity for abstract thinking. And then, so at what point, if you accept the biblical understanding of Adam and Eve with some degree of literalness, certainly it's clear that the ancients didn't have the same idea of history that we have. So that even when they're giving historical, in our view, accounts, this really represents more of a truth that they're trying to communicate by events than any great interest in what actually happened. So in the Indic cultures, circular time became favorite. It's close to nature, the succession of the seasons and night and day and life and death and so forth. So that historical characters that don't have the importance that they have for a culture like the Abrahamic culture that has an end point and sees time in a more chronological form. So the two different ways of seeing basic reality has affected the way people think, and so they sometimes seem to have contradictory ideas of what happened. But obviously reincarnation would be part of the same circular motion that was comfortable for those in the Asiatic East. And the chronological view of time would go better with revelation that includes an end time and a final judgment. Well, of course, science has come down on the side of chronological time as far as there being a definite end. The sun will eventually burn out, as all the other suns have done for billions of years. But the circular motion of time is a factor that also presents some truth about human life. And it makes evolution, while we're still in time, possible as the way in which creation continues to evolve. And so at some point, humans went through the phases that are familiar to us in the development of childhood. That is, a phase of more or less identity without self-reflection that is characteristic of the infant in its first year and perhaps a year and a half. Then the typhonic stage, which is the mixture of consciousness and nature, so that the totem pole is a kind of symbol of it, the half human, half animal capacity that is expressed in children by their dreams, in which they often dream more of animals than of humans. And this is characteristic for, we don't know how long, for hominids, who were first hunter-gatherers, so their attention was fixated in getting enough to eat on a day-to-day basis. They didn't know how to prepare for the future. And there's still a culture that was recently described superbly in the National Geographic that still is hunter-gatherers in Africa, in how they live, and they don't have a government and they don't have a religion. But they live in small groups of maybe up to 20. And so there is a very interesting description of a stage of human development that is very human, but it's certainly not anything that we could, that is very unlike the complexity of human societies as human consciousness continued to developed. So somebody invented agriculture, so you could stow some of it, and then that seems to have given place in historical times both to time to practice religious rituals, and also to make war a favorite occupation of primitive humans that seems still quite popular. So this level of consciousness then also made space for the development of politics, of city-states, and of possessive property and objects and commerce and so on. And this is the period when community was the source of meaning in life to almost everybody, and so much so that a single person could be identified as the community, as in the case of the ritual sacrifice of human beings that was a part of that culture, and even is expressed in the Mayan culture as it's been rediscovered in the very recent decades in South America. They had a very sophisticated culture, but their view of community meant the individual was pretty well subsumed into the community and was at the service of community, and hence there could be a victim chosen from the community on which everyone else could place their scapegoating needs. And thus human sacrifice was characteristic of this age. This is one of the great contributions of Israel and the Jewish culture. They were led through the prophets to oppose human sacrifice, and this was perhaps one of the fruits of the story of Abraham and his willingness to sacrifice his own son, which would have been not an infrequent occurrence then, but because of his choice, Israel led the way in overcoming that kind of human violence. But the point I'm making is that people did not take responsibility for themselves beyond the ideas or values or behaviors or expectations of the community. So they went to war and they married and they had all other kinds of cultural developments that emphasized oneness with community. And that meant defense against other communities, other city-states or other countries as this continued. But the movement of evolution is relentless, and so at some point they begin to take responsibility for themselves. And this is rational consciousness that's introduced maybe only 5,000 years ago or less, and symbolized by Zeus, the god of reason, slaying the dragon, the symbol of emotionality. And so this is the beginning of the patriarchal culture and the domination of men considered as rational over women considered as irrational, or certainly less than human, or different cultures in which exist to this day. So with the arrival of rational consciousness, this is where theology and reflection on religious observance begins to appear. And so this is the moment of Greek philosophy and the experience of Egypt insofar as it was philosophical, and the great teachers of Greece and Rome left us humanity a culture, but it was only possible, and most of it seems to have taken place along with the creation of the major religions in about a period up to 1,000 years ago, more or less, so that the theology then, or metaphysics, appears as one of the major triumphs of all of human evolution up to that point. So it's also clear that some of the members of those communities, once they had reason, surpassed the limitations of rational consciousness, at least in some points, and became transpersonal in their experience, or reached higher stages of consciousness that are manifested in the great writings of the East, especially the Upanishads, or even earlier the Vedas and Lao Tzu. These are all happening at about the same time with the scriptures, and at least in the sense of the Pentateuch being written down, at least in about the same period. And then Christ and Islam coming later. So the knowledge of higher states of consciousness has been present since the Age of Reason began, and there's no way of knowing, how many people may have engaged in those practices, but certainly over time, various practices to support or to find ways of preparing oneself for those higher states of consciousness. There's some question as to whether the higher states of consciousness are simply the natural state, and that this still gives some basis for thinking in terms of the concept of a fall from higher states of consciousness. And certainly there's a fall from something that is a universal experience of humans in every culture. The one thing everybody can agree on is the limitations of human nature and the miseries of human life that are manifested in so many diverse ways. So the sign of the cross, then, is the symbol of the human condition as it is now, where it has begun to have a certain accountability for itself and to take responsibility for its actions, and can't return to the irresponsibility or the innocence of the animal life, which has a certain level of consciousness but is unable to reflect on it and does not have self-consciousness or the capacity for abstract ideas. So at the same time, these higher states of consciousness are not easily available and can't be done without grace, or certainly the invitation to lead a divine human life is beyond the reach of humans at this time. So we have a brain that is capable of spiritual activity, but also a brain that has to sustain the animal instincts and life in order to live in this world. So if God put us in this world, he must have willed in some degree that we experience this dichotomy between the spiritual, purely spiritual, and the material, and is helping us to try to get them together. Rational consciousness seems to be the midpoint of this process, and it's ongoing. The frontal lobes are continuing to develop, they tell us, and as they learn more about the brain, it may be clear that there are further stages of consciousness, even on the basis of physiology, that are yet to come. So meanwhile, man's rational consciousness has been developing at a great rate, and the technological culture we're in right now is the triumph of reason and thinking. But it leaves some things unaddressed, such as the spiritual longing of men and the question of how to lead a divine human life that is modeled in Christ and his incarnation. The higher stages of consciousness as a brief experience can be introduced into the human psyche at any point in their human development, even in the very primitive levels of development. The shamanic consciousness, for instance, of primitive religions and peoples, they sometimes have mystical experiences. Just how advanced are as varied as the levels of consciousness, perhaps all the way up to unity consciousness. But they're not necessarily permanent, so that at any stage, if one is practicing contemplative prayer, this could unfold in a horizontal direction, to use Wilber's terminology, so that the person is experiencing the stages of consciousness in temporary fashion, and can still be stuck on that level of development, such as the mythical membership level. And this explains, it seems to me, how some of the saints must have operated, because you can see from their lives that they're very devoted to God and had experience of higher states of consciousness, and yet they show a singular dependence on their cultural conditioning, or what seems like an excessive limitation, or you expect that they would be more interested, let us say, in justice and peace issues than they manifest. And among the saints, of course, are kings and queens, and maybe a few politicians, but certainly lots of successful professional people and family people. And so we take the culture of the Middle Ages when the women's only choice really was to enter the convent or accept a marriage plan by their parents. Okay? So in some cases, the parents may have been very devout people, may have had mystical experiences, but because they hadn't addressed the dark side or the shadow side of their personality adequately, even though they may have practiced this great fasting and great vigils and so on, they didn't address the main point, which was the deconstruction of the false self and its overdependence on cultural conditioning. So it would seem that the church, or at least the majority of churched people, are somewhat limited and under the influence, undue influence, of excessive identification with their ethnic group, national group, religion in some cases, or whatever the particular group that they draw their identity from, at least in certain respects. Now, the spiritual journey in the mystical life is designed to move beyond those levels and to preserve what was good in them, but also to move beyond their limitations. And in some saints and sages, it seems peculiar that they were so advanced in mystical graces, and yet were so stalled and limited in their corresponding human manifestations of those states by some kind of over-identification. So, in other words, the presence of mystical graces doesn't indicate necessarily a profound spiritual development, unless it shows the ongoing detachment from the lower forms of consciousness to the higher transpersonal levels of consciousness. So this is, I think, a significant contribution of Wilber's insights. And he has studied very thoroughly all the religious, spiritual traditions, as well as being a transpersonal philosopher. But if this is true, and it does answer the question of how saintly people can be so unjust at times, or so wedded to their own cultural way of doing things, and perhaps explains the slowness of the church in sometimes identifying new attitudes that are really inspired by the Spirit, but which are contrary to their human enculturation. So they may even resist or persecute people who have moved to the higher stage and who might have less mystical experience. But the church as a whole seems to be still stuck in an overall mythic membership level of consciousness where the energy is put into maintaining certain rituals or status quo that that occupy a lot of attention that could be put to better use, namely in furthering the actual demolition of the false self and the ego through giving up one's prejudices and biases. And so all religions, it seems to me, are stuck on over-identification with themselves, whereas they are not an end in themselves, but are designed to lead people to the inner freedom of direct and immediate contact with the divine ground within them.
Well, I've always looked upon Vatican II as a time where, as a body, we started to move to the mental egoic and began an experience of freedom there, but then the fear of the mythical membership side of the church began to pull that back again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that seems to have been the case, and it perhaps is going to continue to move in that direction, so that it's very difficult to predict.
It is.
And what the future might be. But in this context, one wonders if the crisis of the priesthood, and especially the scandals that have reached such a height of publicity and couldn't really blacken the church much more, is the church going to hit bottom, or is it going to realize there may be something amiss in its adjustment to the present day world? Is it going to revisit some of its corollaries of accepting the anthropology of Aristotle, and to judge human contact without taking human psychology into adequate account, and thus make the church somewhat irrelevant to a society that is moving more and more into actual discovery of how human nature works at a certain biological level. Like all life cells have basically the same structure. So the unity of the universe and the unity of the human family, is it adequately expressed in church teaching and in church structures and in rules? And just beginning to see the treatment of women for what it is, but nobody is quite ready to do anything about it. of any structural significance. So perhaps the Holy Spirit is doing to the church what it refuses to do itself, namely to bring it to a realization that its presentation, at least, of traditional doctrine is inadequate and not in accord with scientific discoveries of various kinds that require a new cosmology and anthropology that was not available when the scriptures were written or in earlier times. So the mythic membership, of course, will not let go of its structures. And it has a reason behind it that this might lose the deposit of faith in some way. But is this an inspiration of the Spirit or the manifestation of a mistaken starting point in the theology that is about relationship with God and not about metaphysical distinctions between creatures and the divine that are mental or concepts and hence may have a certain rational truth but are going to have to be changed as the understanding or of truths that are based on scientific facts continue to change.
Thomas, I'd like to ask you, this has come to mind as you're talking. People sometimes say, why did you choose the paradigm of higher states of consciousness to begin your exploration of the spiritual journey? Many times people will say, well, he's using Ken Wilber's stuff. Could you explain what brought you to that point to use his material or to use the example of consciousness as a way of opening up more and more the revelation of Scripture and of Christ?
Well, that's a good question. Just how to explain that in a few words. I think that my use of Wilber was chiefly aimed at the shadow side of human nature, because the developmental stages of the perennial philosophy that he describes in Up from Eden, that book, show how the human consciousness keeps expanding and moving beyond the lower stage, incorporating what was good in the lower stages in the new one, and leaving behind its limitations or mistakes. So that it seemed like it highlighted the means that we need to take that are essential in addressing the shadow and the false self and reducing them to at least moderate proportions. By beginning with information that obviously shows their lack of completion or the historical consequences of a generation in holding the views of one that are typical of that level of consciousness. For instance, on the mythical membership level, there's a dependence on the ideas or attitudes or values of the community, so that one is seeking security for oneself and one's survival needs by conforming with the attitudes and the expressions of piety or economic or whatever the particular group is. So in the case of religions, the emphasis on the mythic level of consciousness is to manifest the symbols that are acceptable or demanded by the group as a whole as participating in in this community, so that if we don't carry out those particular things, we're regarded as out or thrust out, as the case may be, depending on the nature of the community. So another mythic membership structure is patriotism, which is which is commendable insofar as it involves gratitude for what we have received from our country and those who have served its needs and defenses and helped to observe its laws and so on. But it also prevents that attitude us from criticizing certain aspects of the group that deserve to be criticized, that are changed and are contrary to our conscience. So a great many double binds arise from the struggle between one's conscience and what is expected in the regard of submission to the generally accepted ideas. So conscientious objection is a classical example. And many people will not resolve that issue because it's not an acute problem for them. They just take for granted, they go with what the authorities or the patriotic or the calls for patriotism, however untrue. If you see the whole panorama of stages that I've tried to show several times, one in the various relations that are possible, that every time one moves to a new level of human development, one's whole relationships change to God, oneself, other people, and then one spends a period of sometimes years in trying to adjust that new insight into all of one's relationships. And they don't all happen at once. Rarely are they instantaneous. And so God is working in all those circumstances to keep us first integrating the new insights and then getting ready to move beyond them to the next one. And this is the meaning of the spiral staircase, which goes down and up at the same time. It's both death and resurrection. As soon as you die to some aspect of the false self or some level of the lower levels of consciousness, one rises to a new level and so on. And that goes on until one reaches the transforming union and perfect humility or perfect love and perfect self-knowledge, or complete, put it that way. There's always a period of contraction or limitation when you are making the transition, like going downstairs, or in an elevator, you get compressed for a while, and then when you open the doors, you have a new vision. Of the whole thing.
Is there anything more you want to say of why you were fascinated by Ken Wilber's Stages of Consciousness?
Well, it seemed to me to explain in a more orderly and reasonable fashion the difficulties that we have to face in the spiritual process, and the actual how we should choose ascetical practices that are appropriate to the stage we're on, and not to imitate somebody's practices who is much more advanced. In other words, it's a continual movement into freedom, and freedom is dependent on responsibility and accountability that the Spirit is moving each of us, as well as is moving the whole corporate of humanity. There's no question that the Enlightenment, apart from its limitations, is an expression of the triumph of rational consciousness in human society, and is a direct forerunner of the technological age. And that triumph of reason, which was the great cry at the Enlightenment, and that justified a lot of the scientific experiments and so on, and the change in politics, especially in Europe, was a manifestation of coming to a certain expertise in rational consciousness, and so, but it challenged, of course, the Church in many ways, which, because they were exalting reason above faith and using it to challenge in many respects the traditional teachings. So, but out of that responsibility came the sense of social action that had been somewhat missing in Christian circles up till then. And the history of those ideas is interesting in that the authorities of the church fought justice and peace issues all the way and tried to silence those who were pressing them because they identified it with the enemies of the church who were challenging the rationality of some of the church teachings and so on. So it was only really in this century and with the insight of Leo XIII that the church began reluctantly to accept, for instance, religious freedom and some degree of pluralism and the importance of conscience. You weren't allowed to have conscience that opposed the church in those days, and so the authorities in any number of papal documents and the activity of bishops just regarded people concerned with social issues as attacking the church. My response to all of the injustices of life is that what do you expect from unevolved creatures? It's not so much, I think, an issue of sin and of losing something that we had, but Genesis is definitely pointing to some kind of experience, maybe the simple unity of the infant who doesn't have a self because it hasn't had time to develop one, but it certainly starts very soon to begin to do so. So God must have understood or preferred to lead humanity by the process of experiencing its weakness rather than its triumph. So the rational approach to life has the great disadvantage of thinking you know something when you really don't.
You really don't, right?
Or that you can control the forces of nature. So what humanity as a whole suffered is two terrible blows: the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, which cast doubts on what had been the absolute acceptance of the religious teachings of the church and its ascendancy and its right to anoint kings and own the papal states and all the other. In other words, the church mistook her mission to be political, that she's finally given up completely, but only within recent memory. And so people have lost faith in the absoluteness or certitude of the religion, at least the Christian religion of Europe. Hence its culture is in a state of decomposition. But also this was being replaced by confidence in the myth of science, that is to say that scientific progress would solve all problems. But 2 world wars have thrown a kind of monkey wrench into that myth. So there isn't any myth. So humanity is faced with a kind of vacuum of meaning that is very difficult for the young to adjust to, but maybe is necessary as part of the evolutionary process.